HDR is a technology that many people either love or hate. Whether you love it or hate it, there's no doubt that getting to know it better can avoid you some costly mistakes when you're processing your photos with HDR. In this video, I'm going to give you my 5 top tips to get natural-looking landscape photos with HDR in Adobe Lightroom. HDR, or High Dynamic Range Imaging, is a technology that's been around for more than a decade now, but it's still misused and even hated by some photographers. I don't believe this is a problem with the technology itself, which is actually quite neutral, but rather a consequence of the fact that when the first HDR programs came on the market, people started using them and experimenting with them, and those programs came with some presets that tended in that direction. So it was quite natural for people to experiment and see where the technology could lead them. That trend quickly went out of fashion, and you don't see many of those photos anymore. As a travel and landscape photographer, I like my photos to look as natural, as believable as possible. But at the same time, I realize that there are situations where the sensor cannot capture the extremes of shadows and highlights that are present in a scene the same way that our eyes can. Our eye and brain combination is a wonderful machine that lets us take in a variety of light levels in a scene naturally and not perceive anything wrong with it, but our cameras don't work the same way. In those circumstances, I like to bracket my shots and to apply HDR in my processing workflow. At the same time, I try to create photos that don't scream HDR at the top of their lungs. I like to create images that even the most attentive observer would not be able to tell whether they were produced using HDR or not. In this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips to create HDR photos that don't look like they were taken on an alien planet, where every color of the spectrum is present on every scene, and where flying magical rainbow unicorns sprinkle magic dust above the landscape. If you'd like to learn more about HDR, my recently released video course will take you all the way from the basics to the most advanced topics, showing you how I conceive and process HDR photos in very challenging situations and different types of light, times of the day, and subjects. You will find a link in the description below. As always, don't forget to smash the subscribe button and hit the notification bell if you want to stay up to date with what I post on this channel. My first tip for getting great HDR photos is to get them right in camera. Or in other words, set yourself up for success. Of course, you can do a lot at the computer, but if you start with a good base, a good starting point, then processing will be much easier. So what are my recommendations for doing things right at the moment of shooting? Well, the first one is to get a stable base for your camera. That usually means using a sturdy tripod. While this is a valuable recommendation for landscape photography in general, especially when the light conditions are marginal, it becomes even more important when shooting HDR, because you typically want your shots in your bracketed sequence to be aligned. Adobe Lightroom and many other HDR processing programs do a wonderful job of aligning photos if the camera moved a little bit between shots. You just need to check the auto-align box on Lightroom, for example. Still, if your photos are already well aligned, there will be much effort from your computer to align them, and there will be no risk of blurry photos because of camera shake and parallax errors because of camera movement. In addition to using a tripod, it's recommended also to use a remote release or a self-timer if you don't have to remote release, to avoid that pressing the shutter button will cause any vibrations. This is especially true for long exposures. If you're using a DSLR camera with a mirror and you want to use the mirror lockup function to eliminate any possible cause of vibrations, please do. I personally shoot mirrorless, so I don't have that need. Then, after having put your camera on the tripod and chosen your composition, it's time to decide what type of mode you want to put the camera in. And I recommended either to use aperture priority or to use manual mode. Aperture priority is fine, or you can use manual mode if you prefer, if that's your preferred modus operandi. Whatever you do, don't use shutter priority. This is important. If you use shutter priority, you will set the shutter speed. And then when using auto bracketing, the camera will have to change the exposure by modifying the aperture. And this impacts depth of field. This means that some areas of the photo, maybe those that are closer to the lens or farther away in the distance, will be sharp in the photos that have a smaller aperture and will be unsharp in the photos that have a larger aperture. And when merging those together, it might create some unwanted artifacts or a general fuzziness of the image itself. Then set your camera to the lowest ISO that you can get with and use your remote release or self-timer to take your bracketed sequence. In order to do so, you can use the auto exposure bracketing feature of your camera. Nowadays, all cameras have one. Or you can use manual bracketing. Auto exposure bracketing works pretty well. You just set the number of steps you want and the distance between each step in terms of exposure values or stops, and then press the shutter and let the camera do its thing. With some models, you have to press the shutter once for each shot in the sequence. With other models, you only have to press once, which is much more convenient. My final recommendation, of course, is to shoot RAW. You can do JPEG and you can do HDR in JPEG, but why would you want to do it? Why would you want to throw away all of that information and compress everything down to 8 bits per pixel when the purpose why we do HDR is to get images that have the most information possible about the scene and then to give us the most freedom to process them at the computer without introducing any artifacts and without losing any information. My second tip is don't do HDR just because you can. This might sound counterintuitive. After all, I'm recommending you what to do about HDR, and here I'm telling you not to do HDR. But there's a reason for that. Essentially, I see that a lot of people, and even me when I started doing HDR, used it as a crutch. When the light conditions were not great, we would do a bracketed sequence and then process the living hell out of our photos using HDR in order to save a bad photo, essentially. If the light conditions are not good, maybe it's better not to take a photo, or maybe just take a photo for a memory and don't process it or don't show it to anyone. If the light conditions are great, you can do HDR, and you should do HDR if you think that there is enough contrast in the scene to warrant bracketing and doing HDR. Sometimes I take a bracketed sequence in the field because I'm not sure whether I have all the information in one shot. But then at the computer, I might look at one of the photos, the one that I think has the best exposure, and look at the histogram and decide that if there are no underexposed shadows or overexposed highlights, I don't need to do an HDR process and use that extra processing power for nothing. If one single photo has a balanced exposure, then I don't need to do HDR. And I can obtain pretty much the same results without doing HDR if my purpose is to get a natural looking photo. Now, of course, if I want to get something that is really unnatural and over the top, I can still do HDR in that situation, but that's generally not what I'm aiming for. My third tip is be careful with those sliders. What I mean by that, when you open up your bracketed sequence in Lightroom and then you do a merge to HDR, what you get is a 32-bit DNG file that has a lot of information in it. And one difference when you go to the develop module in Lightroom that you will see when you're processing a 32-bit DNG file with respect to a normal RAW file is that the range of these sliders, some of the sliders at least, like exposure, contrast, shadows, and highlights, instead of going from -50 to +50, they go from -100 to +100. This reflects the fact that the dynamic information contained in the file is so much larger. So it's easy to go overboard and push those sliders to the limits because there's so much data to be extracted from that. But again, if your aim is to obtain natural-looking photos, you should try to avoid doing that. At the beginning, it's easy to be carried away and just create something that is very crunchy, very colorful, especially if you push the saturation slider. The clarity slider can get you a great crunchy HDR effect with a lot of local contrast, but then ask yourself whether that is what you really want. So be considerate with those sliders. Try to aim for a natural looking result. My fourth recommendation is to preserve your shadows. What do I mean by that? We've seen a lot of HDR photos, especially at the beginning, where people were just recovering so much detail in the shadows because the information is there, and in the highlights, that overall the image had a lot of local contrast, especially if you push those structure or clarity sliders, but it had very little overall contrast. Those images ended up with having the areas that are supposed to be in the shadow with the same average luminosity value as the area that were supposed to be in the highlights, in bright light. The crux of the matter is that light illuminates, but shadows define. Shadows help our eyes make sense of a scene, especially with respect to the three-dimensional relationship of objects. Shadows also help us direct the viewer's gaze towards what we think is the focal point of the image. Our eyes are naturally attracted to bright and contrasty objects and do not spend so much time on objects that are in the shadow. When everything is at the same average luminance value, then the eyes don't know where to stop, and they keep wandering, and they end up wandering outside the photo. So it's important not to eliminate all shadow just because we can, just because we think that all the detail in those areas is important. Sometimes it isn't. My final recommendation, especially as it pertains to Adobe Lightroom, is to learn using local adjustments. Lightroom gives you a set of tools to apply localized adjustment to your photos, like graduated filters, radial filters, adjustment brushes. And together with range masks, which are a very important technology, you can do very refined selections and apply adjustments to only very specific areas in Lightroom, even without using Photoshop and layers and layer masks. This is important because, as I said in the previous tip, we typically want to lead the viewer's gaze towards what we think are the focal points of the image. And we use shadows and highlights and contrast and color in addition to composition to do so. If you know how to apply local adjustment to your photos in order to achieve that goal, your photos will be much more successful because of that. So these were my 5 best tips for doing HDR photography with Adobe Lightroom. I hope you found this little video useful, and if you did, please click on the subscribe button and let your friends know about it. Again, remember, I have a course about HDR in Lightroom. You can find the link in the description below. I hope you will find that even more interesting and useful. Thanks for watching.